The gunshot echoed through Bozeman, Montana like thunder on a clear day, stopping Tessa Norwood in her tracks as she hauled water from the creek back to her cabin. The year was 1876, and while the small mining town had seen its share of violence, gunfire in broad daylight still caused her heart to race. She set down her buckets, wiping calloused hands on her worn apron, watching as men poured from the saloon into the dusty main street. What's happening? Tessa called to old Mrs. Whitley, who stood clutching her shawl despite the summer heat. "Trouble at the Silver Creek mine," the elderly woman replied, voice trembling. "Cave in, they're saying, folks trapped inside." Tessa's stomach dropped. Her younger sister Abigail worked as a cook for the miners. Without another thought, she abandoned her water buckets and ran toward the crowd gathering at the edge of town, her chestnut hair coming loose from its practical bun as she pushed her way through concerned onlookers. The Silver Creek mine sat nestled in the foothills a quarter-mile from town, its timber entrance now partially collapsed, billowing dust still settling in the afternoon sun. Men shouted orders, rushing with picks and shovels toward the mine entrance. The foreman, a beefy man named Harrison, was barking instructions as miners formed a rescue line. "Who's inside?" Tessa demanded, grabbing Harrison's arm. "Is Abigail in there?" Harrison's face was grave beneath the layer of dust. The lunch bell hadn't rung yet. "Your sister was preparing the midday meal when it happened. She's trapped in there, Miss Norwood, along with 7 miners. We're doing everything we can." Tessa felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "How bad is it?" "Bad," Harrison admitted. "Main support beam gave way. The entrance is blocked, and we don't know how stable the interior tunnels are. Could be hours before we reach them if he stopped himself. If they're still alive," Tessa finished, her voice hollow. Harrison avoided her eyes. "We'll do everything possible." The crowd behind her had grown, townspeople whispering and pointing. Tessa caught fragments of their conversations. "Never seen a collapse this bad. Poor souls. It might already be too late." "She's trapped in the mine," they whispered, their voices a terrible chorus that seemed to surround Tessa like circling vultures. A commotion at the edge of the gathering drew her attention. A tall figure on horseback approached, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. Tessa recognized him immediately. Ryker Blackwell, a cowboy who'd arrived in Bozeman 6 months earlier. He worked the cattle ranges outside town and kept mostly to himself, though stories about him abounded that he'd ridden with outlaws once, that he'd killed men in Texas, that he was running from something or someone. Whatever the truth, he commanded respect with his mere presence. Ryker dismounted in one fluid motion, his dark eyes taking in the scene: the collapsed mine entrance, the frantic workers, the grim-faced onlookers. His black Stetson shadowed his face, but Tessa could see the hard line of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze as he approached Harrison. "What happened?" His voice was low, graveled, like stones rolling down a hillside. Harrison wiped sweat from his brow. "Support beam collapsed. Got 8 people trapped inside, 7 miners and the cook." Ryker's eyes flicked to Tessa, noting her distress. "How long?" "Just happened. Maybe 20 minutes ago." "What's the plan?" Ryker asked, already removing his duster. Harrison gestured hopelessly at the blocked entrance. "We're trying to dig through, but it's slow going. Could trigger another collapse if we're not careful." "Is there another way in?" Ryker demanded. "There's an old vertical shaft on the north side, but it was abandoned years ago. Too dangerous." Tessa watched as Ryker studied the mountain, his eyes calculating. He turned to the townspeople. "I need lamps, rope, canteens of water, and someone who knows the layout of this mine." Harrison stepped forward. "You can't be thinking of going in there. That old shaft hasn't been used in years. It's practically a death trap." Ryker's expression didn't change. "Then I'll go where the light can't," he said simply, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "I need a map of the tunnels if you have one." The foreman shook his head. "This is madness. Those people will suffocate before you clear this entrance," Ryker said flatly. "I've worked mines before. I know what I'm doing." Tessa stepped forward, her heart pounding. "My sister is in there." Ryker's dark eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them. "I'm going with you," she declared. "No." His refusal was immediate. "It's too dangerous. Abigail is all the family I have left in this world. Tessa said, her voice steady despite her fear. I won't stand out here waiting to hear if she's dead or alive. I know basic first aid. I can help. Ryker studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined stance the fire in her eyes. Something in his expression shifted. You'll do exactly as I say. Yes, he nodded once. Get changed. Trousers if you have them. Boots. Nothing loose that could catch on something. Tessa didn't hesitate. She ran back to her small cabin at the edge of town, changing quickly into a pair of her late father's trousers and a simple cotton shirt, tying her hair back tightly. She grabbed her father's old leather satchel, filling it with bandages, a small bottle of whiskey for disinfectant, and a jar of salve. By the time she returned to the mine, Ryker had gathered the supplies he needed: coils of rope, several lanterns, canteens, and a crude map of the mine tunnels drawn by Harrison. The old shaft is this way, Harrison said, leading them around the base of the hill. It's about a quarter mile. But I'm telling you, Blackwell, this is a fool's errand. That shaft hasn't been maintained in years. Noted, Ryker replied, his face impassive as he checked the supplies. The abandoned shaft was little more than a dark hole in the ground, partially concealed by brush and debris. Ryker cleared the opening, testing the wooden ladder that descended into darkness. Several of the rungs were rotted through. I'll go first, he said, lighting one of the lanterns. Test each rung before you put your weight on it. If it feels weak, skip it. If I say back up, you back up immediately. Understand, Tessa nodded, her mouth dry. The reality of what they were about to do was sinking in, but the thought of Abigail trapped in the darkness gave her courage. Ryker hung the lantern from his belt and began the descent, the light illuminating the first 20 feet of the shaft before disappearing into absolute blackness. Tessa waited until he called for her to follow, then lowered herself into the hole, the musty smell of earth and decay filling her nostrils. The climb down seemed to take forever, the wooden ladder creaking ominously with each step. Twice, rungs broke beneath her feet, causing her heart to lurch as she scrambled to maintain her grip. Below, Ryker's voice guided her: left side is stronger here, or skip the next one, until finally, after what seemed an eternity, her feet touched solid ground. The air was stale and thin, the darkness absolute except for the pool of light from Ryker's lantern. They were in a narrow tunnel, its timbers sagging with age and pressure. Ryker lit a second lantern and handed it to her. Stay close, he instructed, consulting the crude map. According to this, the main tunnel is about 300 yards east. That's where your sister and the miners would have been when the collapse happened. Tessa nodded, trying to control her breathing in the confined space. How do you know so much about mines? Worked them in Colorado for 5 years, he replied, starting down the tunnel, before I took to cattle. Why did you leave? Ryker was silent for several steps. Lost my brother in a collapse similar to this one. Decided I preferred the sky overhead. The simple statement, delivered without emotion, struck Tessa deeply. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, he said, but she noticed how his shoulders tensed. Watch your head here. They moved slowly through the abandoned tunnel, the air growing thicker with dust as they progressed. Twice they had to crawl through sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed, and once they backtracked when the tunnel ahead was completely sealed by fallen rock. The map shows another route, Ryker said, wiping sweat from his brow as he studied the paper. It'll take longer, but it should connect to the main tunnel eventually. The alternative path was narrower, forcing them to walk single file. Tessa could feel the mountain pressing down on them, countless tons of rock suspended precariously overhead. She focused on Ryker's broad back ahead of her, on the steady rhythm of his steps, trying not to think about the fragility of their situation. How long have you been in Bozeman? She asked, needing conversation to distract her from her fears. 6 months, he replied without turning. And before that, all over, Texas, Arizona Territory, Wyoming, you don't seem the settling type. That earned her a quick glance over his shoulder. I'm not. Yet you've stayed in Bozeman longer than most places from the sound of it. He was silent for several steps. Found work with the Morrison spread, decent pay, no questions asked. Everyone has a past, Mr. Blackwell. Some are best left buried. They continued in silence until the tunnel widened slightly and connected with another passage. Ryker paused, consulting the map again. We're getting close to the main tunnel. Listen. Tessa held her breath. At first she heard nothing but the soft creak of timbers and the distant drip of water, then faint but unmistakable the sound of tapping. That's a miner's signal, Ryker said, his face lighting with grim satisfaction. They're alive, hope surged through Tessa. Abigail, don't shout, Ryker warned. Could trigger a collapse, we need to follow the sound. They moved more quickly now, Ryker pausing occasionally to tap a response on the tunnel wall with the handle of his knife. The answering taps grew louder as they navigated the twisting passages, until finally they reached a section where the tunnel ahead was partially blocked by fallen rock and timber. They're just beyond this, Ryker said, examining the collapse. Hello, he called, his voice controlled but carrying. Can you hear me? Yes, came a muffled response. Thank God we're trapped. Are you injured? Ryker called back. 3 men hurt, came the reply. Not too bad, air's getting thin. We're coming through, Ryker promised. He turned to Tessa. Ask about your sister. Abigail, Tessa called. Abigail Norwood, is she with you? A pause then. She's here, she's okay. Tears of relief sprang to Tessa's eyes. Thank God, Ryker was already assessing the blockage. We need to clear this carefully. One wrong move could bring the whole section down. They worked methodically, Ryker identifying which rocks could be safely removed and which were supporting the precarious ceiling. Tessa followed his instructions precisely, ignoring the ache in her arms and the cuts on her hands as they gradually created an opening large enough to pass through. After nearly an hour of painstaking work, Ryker finally created a hole big enough to crawl through. I'll go first, he said. Wait until I call you. He squeezed through the narrow gap, his lantern creating strange shadows as he disappeared. A moment later, his voice called back. It's clear. Come through. Tessa didn't hesitate. She pushed her satchel ahead of her and wriggled through the opening, emerging into a wider chamber where the beam of her lantern revealed a group of dust-covered, haggard-looking men, and among them her sister Abigail. Tessa. Abigail cried, rushing forward to embrace her. At 20, she was 2 years younger than Tessa, with the same chestnut hair and determined chin. How did you find us? Mr. Blackwell knew about an old shaft, Tessa explained, quickly examining her sister for injuries. Are you hurt? Just scratches, Abigail assured her. But Johnson has a broken arm, and Peters hit his head pretty bad, and Taylor's leg is trapped under a beam. Ryker was already kneeling beside a young miner pinned beneath a heavy wooden support beam. The man's face was gray with pain, his leg crushed beneath the weight. We tried to move it, one of the other miners explained, but it shifted and nearly brought down more of the ceiling. Ryker nodded, studying the situation. We need to brace the ceiling before we move this, he said. Otherwise, we all die. He organized the able-bodied miners to create temporary supports using debris from the collapse, while Tessa attended to the injured men. Johnson's arm was a clean break that she splinted using pieces of wood and strips torn from her petticoat. Peters had a nasty gash on his forehead that she cleaned and bandaged, relieved to find his pupils responding normally to her lantern light. By the time she finished, Ryker had rigged a system of braces and levers that he believed would allow them to lift the beam off Taylor's leg without triggering another collapse. On my count, he instructed the miners. Steady pressure, don't jerk it. The men positioned themselves as directed, and at Ryker's command, they lifted in unison. The beam rose just enough for Abigail to pull Taylor free. His leg was badly mangled, the bone visible through torn flesh. He'll lose it if we don't get him to a doctor soon, Tessa said quietly to Ryker as she applied a tourniquet. Ryker nodded grimly. We need to move. The air's getting worse and this section isn't stable. He consulted with the miners about the most direct route back to the old shaft, learning that there was another partially collapsed section they would need to navigate. With Taylor unable to walk and Peters unsteady on his feet, their progress would be slow. I'll carry Taylor, Ryker decided. Harrison, you help Peters. The rest of you follow Miss Norwood. I'll bring up the rear. Tessa led the way, her lantern illuminating the narrow passage as they moved in single file back toward the abandoned shaft. The air grew thicker with dust as they progressed, and several times they had to stop, while Ryker adjusted Taylor's position to maneuver through tight spaces. They had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes when a low rumble vibrated through the mountain. Tiny pebbles showered down from the ceiling, and a fine cloud of dust billowed through the tunnel. "Everyone stop," Ryker commanded. "Don't move." They froze, hardly daring to breathe as the rumbling continued for several seconds before subsiding. What was that? Abigail whispered, her face pale in the lantern light. "The mountain's settling," one of the miners answered grimly. "Could be the rescue crews digging at the main entrance, causing shifts." "We need to move faster," Ryker said, adjusting Taylor's limp form across his shoulders. The injured man had passed out from pain, which was perhaps a mercy. They continued with greater urgency, the fear of another collapse spurring them on despite exhaustion. When they reached the section that had been partially blocked, they found that the recent tremor had widened the gap, allowing them to pass through more easily than Tessa and Ryker had on their way in. "We're getting close," Tessa encouraged the group, recognizing landmarks from their earlier journey. "The shaft can't be more than 100 yards ahead." They had just rounded a bend in the tunnel when another, stronger tremor shook the mountain. This time, the rumble didn't stop. A massive crack split the ceiling ahead, and with a deafening roar, the tunnel began to collapse. "Back," Ryker shouted, thrusting Taylor into the arms of two miners. "Everyone back." They retreated as the ceiling came down in a thunderous avalanche of rock and timber, the cloud of dust temporarily blinding them as they stumbled away from the collapse. When the dust cleared enough to see, they found the way forward completely blocked by tons of fallen rock. "Is everyone all right?" Ryker called, counting heads in the dim lantern light. They had all escaped the collapse, but now they were trapped between two blockages, with no way forward to the shaft and no way back to the main tunnel. "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. Ryker was already examining the walls of their section, tapping methodically. "There should be a ventilation shaft somewhere in this area," he said. "Old mines like this usually had air shafts dug every few hundred feet." The miners joined his search, tapping the walls and ceiling, looking for the hollow sound that would indicate another passage. After several tense minutes, one of them called out. "Here, it sounds different here." Ryker joined him, pressing his ear to the wall. "That's it. Help me clear this section." They worked feverishly, using picks and bare hands to break through the thin wall of rock that had been built to seal the old air shaft. When they finally broke through, a rush of slightly fresher air greeted them, not clean, but less stale than what they had been breathing. "It's narrow," Ryker said, shining his lantern into the vertical shaft, "but it should lead to the surface." The shaft was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, with crude handholds carved into the rock at intervals. It extended upward into darkness, how far they couldn't tell. "Can we get the injured men through that?" Tessa asked doubtfully. Ryker's face was grim. "We have to. There's no other way out." They fashioned a harness from their ropes to secure Taylor, who was still unconscious. The plan was for two of the stronger miners to climb ahead, pulling Taylor up after them using the rope system. Ryker would guide from below, keeping the injured man from scraping against the rough walls of the shaft. "You'll go next," Ryker told Tessa and Abigail. "Then Peters and Johnson. I'll come last." The ascent was grueling. The air shaft twisted as it rose, sometimes widening enough to provide brief rest, sometimes narrowing so tightly that they had to exhale completely to squeeze through. The injured men suffered terribly, but there was no alternative. Behind them, they could hear more settling in the mountain, the mine groaning like a wounded beast. They had been climbing for what seemed like hours when the lead miner called down that he could see stars. A collective sigh of relief passed through the group. One by one, they emerged onto the hillside above the mine, gulping the sweet night air gratefully. They were perhaps half a mile from where they had entered the old shaft, on the opposite side of the hill from the main entrance. In the distance, they could see the lights of the rescue operation still working to clear the collapsed entrance. "We need to get Taylor to town," Tessa said, checking the young miner's pulse. It was weak, but steady. They fashioned a stretcher from branches and jackets, and began the careful descent toward town, Ryker carrying the front of the stretcher. refusing to relinquish the burden despite his obvious exhaustion. The town erupted in astonishment and joy when the bedraggled group appeared out of the darkness. Dr. Simmons was summoned immediately, and the injured miners were taken to his surgery. The rest were enveloped by relieved family members and friends who had been keeping vigil. Tessa watched as Ryker quietly stepped away from the celebrations, moving to retrieve his horse from where he had left it hours earlier. "You're leaving," she called, breaking away from Abigail to follow him. He turned, his face shadowed in the pre-dawn light. "My work here is done." Without even letting them thank you, a hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'm not one for speeches and handshakes, Miss Norwood." "Then let me thank you," she said simply. "You saved my sister's life, all their lives." Something flickered in his dark eyes, and emotion quickly masked. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Tessa said firmly. "They wouldn't have. The others were willing to wait, to dig from the outside. You were willing to go where no one else dared." He looked away, uncomfortable with her praise. "I should go." "At least let me tend to your hands first," she insisted. Noticing the deep cuts and abrasions that covered his palms and fingers from hours of clearing rock and climbing, he hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "If you insist." Tessa led him to her cabin, where she heated water and carefully cleaned his wounded hands. He sat in silence as she worked, his eyes taking in the simple, neat interior of the home she shared with Abigail. "You have no one else?" he asked suddenly. "Besides your sister?" Tessa shook her head. "Our parents died 2 years ago. Influenza. We've been on our own since then." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "It's not easy." "No," she agreed, applying salve to his palms, "but we manage." She hesitated, then added, "You said you lost your brother in a mine collapse." 10 years ago. "And the rest of your family," his jaw tightened, "gone before that, father to a bullet in a saloon fight, mother to consumption when I was 15. So you understand being alone." His eyes met hers, "Better than most." When she finished bandaging his hands, he stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Thank you. Will you stay in Bozeman?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "For a while longer, perhaps." Something in his tone gave her courage. "I hope so, Mr. Blackwell." The faintest smile touched his lips. "Ryker," he corrected her. "Good night, Miss Norwood." "Tessa," she returned. He nodded once, then disappeared into the gray light of dawn. The story of the mine rescue spread quickly through Bozeman and the surrounding territory. Newspapers as far away as Helena carried accounts of the cowboy who had descended into an abandoned shaft to save 8 trapped souls. Though Ryker avoided the attention, refusing interviews and deflecting praise, his reputation in the community was transformed overnight. To Tessa's surprise, he remained in Bozeman. He continued working at the Morrison Ranch, but now he occasionally came into town for supplies or a rare meal at the hotel restaurant. Whenever their paths crossed, he would acknowledge her with a nod or a brief greeting, but never sought her company. It was Abigail who finally lost patience with the situation. 3 weeks after the mine collapse, she confronted her sister over breakfast. "He saved our lives, Tessa. The least you could do is bring him a proper meal to thank him." "He doesn't want thanks," Tessa protested. "He made that clear." Abigail rolled her eyes. "Men never say what they actually want. I've seen how he looks at you when you're not watching. Take him some of your apple pie. No man alive can resist your apple pie." "That's ridiculous," Tessa muttered, but the idea took root. The next afternoon found her riding out to the Morrison Ranch, a basket containing a still warm apple pie, a jar of preserved peaches, and some fresh bread balanced carefully before her on the saddle. She told herself it was simply a gesture of gratitude, nothing more, but the flutter in her stomach as she approached the ranch suggested otherwise. She found Ryker in the corral, breaking a spirited young Mustang. He worked with quiet confidence, his movements economical and precise as he guided the nervous animal in gradual circles. When he spotted Tessa, he handed the reins to another ranch hand and approached the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. "Miss Norwood," he greeted her, genuinely surprised. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she assured him, suddenly feeling foolish. I brought you something, a proper thank you for what you did." His eyes went to the basket, and something like embarrassment crossed his features. "That wasn't necessary." I wanted to, she said simply. It's just some food, apple pie mainly. Abigail says no man can resist my apple pie, a ghost of a smile. Does she now? She's usually right about such things. He glanced back at the Mustang, then at the position of the sun. I'm almost finished here. Would you like to share it? There's a nice spot by the creek. His invitation surprised her as much as it pleased her. I'd like that. They rode to the creek together, a pretty spot where cottonwoods provided shade from the afternoon sun. Tessa spread a cloth on the grass and arranged the food while Ryker saw to the horses. This is quite a feast, he commented, sitting across from her with an ease that belied his usual reserve. Baking helps me think, she explained, cutting generous slices of pie. And I've had a lot to think about lately. The mine, he asked, accepting the plate she offered, among other things. She watched as he took a bite of the pie, unable to suppress a smile at his appreciative expression. Abigail was right, I see. About the pie, absolutely. He took another bite. What else has been on your mind, if you don't mind my asking? Tessa looked out at the creek, gathering her thoughts. The future, mainly. The mine is closed indefinitely after the collapse. Abigail needs new employment. And you? What do you do in Bozeman, besides bake exceptional pies? I sew, take in laundry, occasionally help Dr. Simmons when he has multiple patients. She shrugged. Whatever work I can find. You were good in the mine, Ryker observed. Steady, skilled with those injuries. My father taught us basic medicine. He believed women should know how to tend wounds as well as hem skirts. A progressive man, he was. She studied Ryker's face, noticing how the sunlight caught the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. May I ask you something personal? He hesitated, then nodded. Why did you really stay in Bozeman? After the mine rescue, I mean. I had the impression you were the type to move on frequently. Ryker set down his plate, considering her question. I was, he admitted. For a long time, staying in one place felt confining. And now, his eyes met hers directly. Now I'm finding reasons to reconsider that position. The simple statement, delivered without artifice, made her heart quicken. I'm glad, she said softly. They talked for hours, the afternoon stretching into evening as they shared stories of their lives. Ryker spoke of his years drifting across the West, working cattle drives and breaking horses from Texas to Montana. Tessa told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents' decision to move west after the war in search of a new beginning, about the hardships and small joys of building a life in Bozeman. As dusk fell, Ryker reluctantly said he needed to return to the ranch to finish his duties. He helped Tessa pack the basket, their hands brushing occasionally, each contact sending a current of awareness through her. May I call on you properly sometime? He asked as he helped her mount her horse. I'd like that very much, she replied. True to his word, Ryker appeared at her cabin 3 days later, freshly shaved and wearing his good shirt, a bunch of wildflowers in hand. Abigail made herself scarce after serving them tea, her meaningful glances at Tessa both embarrassing and amusing. Over the following weeks, Ryker became a regular visitor. They walked along the creek, attended the community dance, where he surprised her with his grace despite his initial reluctance, and spent evenings on her porch talking as the stars emerged overhead. He was not a man given to flowery words or grand gestures, but in his steady presence and thoughtful actions, Tessa found something far more valuable than empty romance. Summer gave way to autumn, and the leaves along the creek turned gold and crimson. Tessa found work assisting the new schoolteacher with the younger children, while Abigail took a position at the hotel restaurant. Ryker continued at the Morrison Ranch, but now spent most of his free time in town, specifically at the Norwood cabin. It was on a crisp October evening as they walked back from a town gathering that Ryker finally spoke the thoughts that had clearly been weighing on him. Tessa, he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. I've never been good with words, never saw much use for them when actions speak clearer. She waited, her heart beating faster as they paused beneath a large oak tree at the edge of town. That day in the mine, he continued, when I heard people were trapped, I didn't think twice about going in. It felt like a chance to do what I couldn't do for my brother all those years ago. He looked down at their joined hands. But it was more than that. When I saw you, determined to find your sister no matter the risk, something changed in me. Ryker, please, let me finish. I've been running most of my life, from memories, from attachments, from putting down roots. I told myself it was freedom, but I think now it was fear. His eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. I don't want to run anymore, Tessa. For the first time, I want to stay, build something lasting, with you if you'll have me. Tears pricked at Tessa's eyes as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver ring, simple but beautifully crafted. It was my mother's, he explained. The only thing of value I've carried with me all these years. Tessa Norwood, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Ryker. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her close, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that left them both breathless. The wedding took place in November, a simple ceremony in the town's small church. Abigail served as maid of honor, beaming with satisfaction at her role in bringing the couple together. The entire town turned out to celebrate, including the miners who had been rescued that fateful day, even old Mrs. Whitley shed tears of joy for the couple whose love had been forged in darkness and danger. With money he had carefully saved, Ryker purchased a small parcel of land just outside town, with good pasture and access to the creek. Together, they built a modest home, Tessa planning the layout with an eye toward the future, including a room that might someday become a nursery. The following spring, as wildflowers carpeted the hills around Bozeman, Tessa shared the news that their family would indeed be growing. The joy in Ryker's eyes as he placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach was something she would treasure forever. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed that night as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. A home, a wife. A child on the way. He shook his head in wonder. For years, I believed happiness wasn't meant for men like me. And now, Tessa asked, leaning into his embrace, now I know better. He kissed her temple gently. You showed me that even the darkest places can lead to light, if you're brave enough to follow the path. As Summer returned to Montana territory, their son was born a strong, healthy boy they named Samuel, after Ryker's lost brother. Abigail, now engaged to the town's young doctor, doted on her nephew and teased the new parents mercilessly about their obvious adoration of the infant. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, of challenges met together and joys shared. Ryker proved to be a natural father, his earlier reticence giving way to an open affection that sometimes brought tears to Tessa's eyes. He built a thriving horse breeding operation, his skill with difficult animals earning him respect throughout the territory, while Tessa began teaching more regularly at the school, bringing Samuel with her when he was old enough. 2 years after Samuel's birth, they welcomed a daughter, Catherine, completing their family. The Blackwell home became known for its warmth and hospitality, a gathering place for friends and travelers alike. On the 5th anniversary of the mine rescue, the town of Bozeman erected a small monument commemorating the event and honoring Ryker's courage. He attended the ceremony reluctantly, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding its importance to the community that had become his home. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ryker found Tessa sitting on their porch, gazing at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "How strange life is," she replied, taking his hand. "If that mine hadn't collapsed, if you hadn't been in town that day, if either of us had been a little less stubborn, we might never have found each other," he finished. "Exactly." He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've been thinking about something you said once, about going where the light can't. The day of the rescue," he nodded. "I said it without really understanding what it meant. I thought I was just talking about the mine. And now I think it means something more." His eyes, softer than they had been in those early days, met hers. Sometimes the most precious things are found in the darkest places. Sometimes you have to walk through fear and darkness to find what you're meant to have. Tessa leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had been her anchor these past 5 years. "I'd follow you into any darkness, Ryker Blackwell. And I'd always lead you back to the light," he promised. sealing the vow with a kiss as the Montana stars shone overhead, witnesses to a love that had indeed been forged in darkness but would flourish in light for all the years to come. As Bozeman grew from a mining town into a proper city, the Blackwells grew with it. Ryker expanded his horse business to include a stage-coach line connecting Bozeman to Helena, while Tessa eventually became the headmistress of the town's first proper school. Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, showing a natural affinity for horses, while Catherine surprised everyone with her interest in medicine, eventually studying under Dr. Simmons. Abigail and her doctor husband built their own home not far from the Blackwells, blessing Tessa and Ryker with nieces and nephews who frequently filled both houses with laughter and mischief. The two families celebrated holidays together, weathered hardships together, and watched with pride as their children grew into capable, compassionate adults. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire town gathered to celebrate the couple whose story had become something of a local legend. There was music and dancing, feasting and toasting, but the moment Tessa would remember most came late in the evening, when Ryker led her away from the celebration to the quiet banks of the creek where he had first shared her apple pie. Under a canopy of stars remarkably similar to those of their courtship days, he presented her with a locket containing miniature portraits of their children, and to her surprise, a new wedding ring to accompany her mother's silver band that had never left her finger. 25 years, he marveled, sliding the gold band alongside the silver one. If someone had told that lonely cowboy what awaited him in Bozeman, he'd never have believed it. And if someone had told that worried young woman that the taciturn stranger would become the center of her world, Tessa replied, touching his lined but still handsome face, she might not have been quite so intimidated by him. Ryker laughed, the sound as rare and precious as it had always been. You were never intimidated by me, Tessa Blackwell. Not from the moment you demanded to come with me into that mine. Perhaps not, she conceded with a smile, but I certainly never imagined all this. No regrets, he asked, a hint of the old vulnerability surfacing briefly. Not one, she answered without hesitation. Every step of our journey, even the difficult ones, brought us here. How could I regret that? As they rejoined the celebration, surrounded by friends, family, and the community that had embraced them, Tessa reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together: a mine collapse, a desperate rescue, a journey into darkness that had ultimately led to a lifetime of light. Later that night, as they walked home beneath the Montana stars, Ryker's arm steady around her waist just as it had been for 25 years, Tessa knew with absolute certainty that their story, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and enduring love, would be told in Bozeman for generations to come. And she was perfectly content with that.